The story of ancient Israel begins not with grand declarations or royal proclamations, but with the sound of a single stone cutting through the morning air in the valley of Elah. Young David, barely more than a shepherd boy, had just felled the giant Goliath with nothing more than faith, skill, and unwavering determination. This moment, sometime around 1020 BCE, would echo through history as the beginning of Israel's greatest era. The Philistine champion lay dead, his massive bronze armor glinting in the Palestinian sun, while 40,000 Israelite warriors who had cowered in fear for 40 days suddenly found their voices in thunderous celebration. King Saul, watching from his position on the hillside, must have felt a mixture of relief and unease. The immediate threat was over, but something had shifted in that valley. The shepherd boy who had volunteered for what seemed like certain death had not only survived, but had done so with such confidence, such divine favor, that even the most hardened soldiers were whispering about the hand of God being upon him. David's victory was not merely military, it was prophetic, symbolic of the transition that was already beginning in the kingdom of Israel. The aftermath of Goliath's defeat rippled through both armies like stones thrown into still water. The Philistines, seeing their champion struck down, fled in panic toward their coastal cities of Gath and Ekron. The Israelites, energized by this miraculous turn of events, pursued them with a ferocity they had not shown in years. The spoils of war were considerable, but more important was the restoration of Israelite confidence. For too long, they had been a loose confederation of tribes, struggling against better, organized and better, equipped enemies. Now, for the first time in generations, they had a hero who seemed to carry the blessing of the Almighty himself. David's integration into Saul's court happened swiftly. The king, who had been suffering from what the biblical text describes as an evil spirit, found peace when David played his lyre. The young man's musical talents were as remarkable as his courage, and soon he became both armor bearer and court musician to the troubled monarch. This dual role placed David at the very center of Israel's political and military life, giving him unprecedented access to the inner workings of the kingdom, while simultaneously building his reputation among the people. The relationship between Saul and David during these early years was complex and ultimately tragic. Saul recognized David's extraordinary abilities and even gave him command positions in the army, where the young warrior's success continued to grow. Every military campaign David led resulted in victory. Every challenge he faced seemed to strengthen rather than diminish him. The people began to sing songs about their new hero, comparing his achievements favorably even to those of the king himself. The women would dance in the streets, chanting that Saul had slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. This popular acclaim planted the seeds of jealousy and paranoia in Saul's heart. The king began to see David not as an asset, but as a threat to his dynasty. The prophet Samuel had already told Saul that his kingdom would not endure, that God had rejected him as king because of his disobedience. Now, watching David's meteoric rise, Saul began to suspect that this shepherd boy might be his divinely appointed successor. The realization filled him with a rage that would consume the remaining years of his reign and ultimately lead to his destruction. The cat and mouse game between Saul and David that followed reads like an ancient thriller. Multiple times, Saul attempted to kill David directly, hurling spears at him during court sessions or sending him on impossible military missions, hoping the Philistines would finish what he could not. But David seemed to lead a charmed life, evading every trap and emerging from every dangerous assignment, not only alive but victorious. The king's own children began to align themselves with David. Jonathan, Saul's eldest son and heir apparent, formed an unbreakable covenant of friendship with David, even going so far as to warn him of his father's murderous intentions. Michal, Saul's daughter, fell in love with David and became his first wife, creating family ties that made Saul's hostility even more complicated and painful. When direct assassination failed, Saul turned to more systematic persecution. He declared David an outlaw and began a relentless pursuit that would last for years. David was forced to flee to the wilderness, gathering around him a band of outcasts, debtors, and malcontents who saw in him a leader worth following. This period of exile, rather than breaking David, forged him into the leader Israel needed. He learned to command men who had nothing to lose, to survive in harsh terrain, to make alliances with unlikely partners, and to maintain his integrity even when survival seemed to demand compromise. The most remarkable aspect of David's fugitive years was his restraint toward Saul. Twice, David had perfect opportunities to kill the king who was hunting him. Once in a cave at En-Gedi, and again when Saul was sleeping in his camp. David could have ended his persecution with a single stroke. Both times he refused, declaring that he would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed, even though that same anointed was trying to kill him. This moral consistency, this respect for divine authority, even when that authority was being abused, marked David as a man of extraordinary character and helped establish the legitimacy of his eventual claim to the throne. During his outlaw years, David also demonstrated remarkable political acumen. He cultivated relationships with tribal leaders throughout Judah, his home territory, providing protection for their communities and sharing the spoils of his raids against Israel's enemies. He formed temporary alliances with Philistine kings, walking the dangerous line between survival and treason. Most importantly, he began to build the network of loyal followers who would form the core of his administration when he finally became king. The end came for Saul not through David's hand, but through his own tragic choices. Facing a massive Philistine invasion at Mount Gilboa, the increasingly unstable king consulted a medium at Endor, seeking guidance from the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel. The ghostly Samuel delivered a devastating prophecy. Saul and his sons would die in battle the next day, and the kingdom would pass to David. The prophecy proved accurate. Saul, wounded and facing capture, fell on his own sword rather than be taken alive. Jonathan and 2 other royal sons died alongside their father, ending the dynasty and clearing the way for David's rise. When news of Saul's death reached David in the Philistine city of Ziklag, his reaction revealed the complexity of his character. Rather than celebrating the removal of his greatest obstacle, David composed a lament for Saul and Jonathan that ranks among the most beautiful pieces of poetry in ancient literature. He mourned genuinely for the man who had tried to kill him and grieved deeply for the friend who had protected him. He ordered that the news not be proclaimed in the Philistine cities, lest Israel's enemies rejoice over the fall of God's anointed king. This magnanimity and victory would become a hallmark of David's leadership. The path to unified kingship was not immediate. Initially, David was crowned king only over his own tribe of Judah, establishing his capital at Hebron. The northern tribes, meanwhile, rallied around Ishbosheth, a surviving son of Saul, creating a civil war that would last for 7 years. This period tested David's patience and political skills as he worked to gradually win over the northern tribes without appearing to be an aggressor against Saul's legitimate heir. The civil war was marked by a series of skirmishes and political maneuvers rather than major battles. David's forces, led by his nephew Joab, consistently outperformed the northern army under Abner, Saul's former general. Gradually, it became clear that David's cause was ascendant. The turning point came when Abner himself, after a dispute with Ishbosheth, decided to switch sides and bring the northern tribes over to David. This defection might have ended the war immediately, but Joab, seeking revenge for his brother's death at Abner's hands, assassinated the general during peace negotiations. David's response to Abner's murder demonstrated his political wisdom and moral authority. He publicly mourned the general, declaring that a great man had fallen in Israel, and he distanced himself completely from Joab's action. This public display of grief and justice helped convince the northern tribes that David was not simply a Judahite king seeking to dominate them, but a leader who could unite all Israel with fairness and respect for all the tribes. When Ishbosheth was subsequently murdered by 2 of his own officers, who brought his head to David expecting a reward, the future king's response was swift and decisive. He executed the assassins, declaring that if he had punished the man who claimed to have killed Saul, how much more would he punish those who killed an innocent man in his own house? This consistent pattern of justice and mercy, even toward his enemies, established David's reputation as a righteous ruler and made his eventual acceptance by all the tribes almost inevitable. Around 1005 BCE, representatives from all 12 tribes gathered at Hebron to anoint David as king over all Israel. The ceremony was both a political necessity and a religious celebration. The tribal leaders acknowledged David's military prowess, his divine favor, and his legitimate claim to the throne through his anointing by Samuel years earlier. More practically, they recognized that only under David's leadership could Israel hope to defend itself against the Philistines and other regional powers that threatened their survival. David's first major decision as king of all Israel was both bold and brilliant. He would establish a new capital city that belonged to no single tribe, thereby avoiding favoritism and creating a symbol of national unity. His target was Jerusalem, a Jebusite stronghold that had remained unconquered throughout the period of the Judges and the reigns of Saul. The city sat on the border between the territories of Judah and Benjamin, making it geographically ideal for a national capital. Moreover, its capture would demonstrate David's power while providing Israel with one of the most defensible positions in the entire region. The conquest of Jerusalem became the stuff of legend. The Jebusites, confident in their city's natural defenses, taunted David's forces, claiming that even the blind and lame could defend their walls. David's response was to offer a reward to whoever could find a way into the city, leading to the famous assault through the water shaft that brought his warriors directly into the heart of the fortress. The fall of Jerusalem was swift and decisive, and David immediately set about transforming the ancient Canaanite stronghold into the political and religious center of Israel. The establishment of Jerusalem as the city of David marked the beginning of a new era in Israelite history. For the first time since the days of Joshua, all 12 tribes were united under a single ruler, and that ruler possessed a capital city that was both strategically located and symbolically powerful. David began an extensive building program, constructing a palace complex, administrative buildings, and defensive works that would make Jerusalem one of the most important cities in the ancient Near East. But David understood that political unity required more than just military success and administrative efficiency. Israel needed a spiritual center that would bind the tribes together in worship as well as governance. His solution was to bring the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in Israelite religion, to Jerusalem. The Ark had been captured by the Philistines decades earlier, and after causing them considerable trouble, had been returned to Israel but left in the obscure town of Kiriath Jearim. David's decision to retrieve it and install it in Jerusalem was both religiously significant and politically astute. The procession that brought the Ark to Jerusalem was one of the most joyous celebrations in Israel's history. David himself danced before the Ark with such abandon that his wife Michal was embarrassed by his undignified behavior. But the king understood something his royal wife did not. This was not a time for dignity, but for celebration. The presence of the Ark in Jerusalem would make the city not just the political capital, but the religious heart of the nation, ensuring that all 12 tribes would have reason to come there regularly for worship and festivals. With Jerusalem established and the Ark installed, David turned his attention to the military challenges that faced his new kingdom. The Philistines, recognizing that a unified Israel under competent leadership posed a serious threat to their dominance in the region, launched a series of attacks designed to crush David's kingdom before it could fully establish itself. These campaigns would test everything David had learned during his years as a fugitive and his time as king of Judah. The first major Philistine offensive came shortly after David's coronation as king of all Israel. The enemy forces advanced into the valley of Rephaim, threatening Jerusalem itself. David's response demonstrated both his military genius and his continued reliance on divine guidance. Rather than simply attacking, he inquired of the Lord through the established religious channels, receiving specific tactical instructions for each engagement. In the first battle, he was told to attack directly; in the second, to circle around and attack from behind when he heard the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees. Both battles resulted in decisive Israelite victories, with the Philistines suffering such heavy casualties that they abandoned their invasion plans and retreated to their coastal strongholds. David pursued them relentlessly, capturing their idols and destroying their military capacity in the region. These victories established Israel's military superiority and sent a clear message to other potential enemies that the new kingdom was not to be trifled with. The success against the Philistines was followed by a series of campaigns that expanded Israel's borders and influence far beyond anything achieved under Saul. David's armies marched north against the Arameans of Damascus, east against the Moabites and Ammonites, and south against the Edomites. Each campaign was carefully planned and brilliantly executed, resulting in a string of victories that made Israel the dominant power in the southern Levant. The conquest of the Aramean kingdoms was particularly significant, as it brought Israel into contact with the great powers of Mesopotamia and established David as a player on the international stage. The tribute and spoils from these campaigns provided the resources needed to fund David's building projects in Jerusalem and to maintain the professional army that had made these victories possible. More importantly, the conquests created a buffer zone around Israel's core territory, providing security that would allow the kingdom to prosper and develop. David's treatment of conquered peoples revealed both his pragmatism and his sense of justice. Some enemies, like the Moabites who had once given him refuge, were treated with relative leniency. Others, like the Ammonites who had humiliated his ambassadors, faced harsher consequences. But in all cases, David sought to create stable arrangements that would prevent future conflicts while acknowledging Israel's new status as a regional hegemon. The military successes were accompanied by administrative innovations that helped transform Israel from a loose tribal confederation into a centralized kingdom. David established a professional bureaucracy with appointed officials responsible for various aspects of government. He created a standing army with both Israelite and foreign components, including his famous bodyguard of Sherethites and Pelethites. He instituted regular taxation and tribute collection, providing the steady revenue stream that any stable government required. Perhaps most importantly, David began the process of codifying and centralizing Israel's religious practices. While the full development of temple worship would wait for his son Solomon, David organized the priests and Levites, established regular sacrificial routines, and began composing the psalms that would become central to Israelite worship for centuries to come. His combination of political and religious authority created a model of kingship that would influence not only Israel, but many other nations throughout the ancient world. The establishment of David's kingdom also had profound implications for Israel's relationship with its God. The promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob about their descendants becoming a great nation seemed to be reaching fulfillment under David's rule. The king himself was seen as God's chosen representative, ruling by divine appointment and with divine blessing. This theological understanding of kingship would become central to Israelite political thought and would influence expectations about future rulers throughout the monarchy period. As David's reign progressed and his kingdom stabilized, the king began to contemplate even greater achievements. He had united the tribes, conquered Jerusalem, defeated Israel's enemies, and established a powerful and prosperous kingdom. But one thing troubled him. While he lived in a magnificent palace of cedar wood, the Ark of the Covenant, representing God's presence among his people, remained in a simple tent. David began to dream of building a permanent temple, a house for God that would surpass anything previously constructed and would serve as the ultimate symbol of Israel's devotion to their divine king. When David shared his vision with the prophet Nathan, the initial response was encouraging. Nathan told the king to proceed with his plans, assuming that such a pious project would surely have divine approval. But that night, Nathan received a revelation that would reshape both David's understanding of his role and Israel's expectations about the future. God's message was both a gentle rebuke and an extraordinary promise. The rebuke was simple: David would not build the temple. He had been a man of war, shedding much blood in his campaigns to establish and defend the kingdom. The temple, as a house of peace and worship, would be built by his son, a man of peace who would inherit a secure and stable kingdom. This restriction must have been deeply disappointing to David, who had probably already begun planning the magnificent structure in his mind. But the promise that accompanied the rebuke was beyond anything David could have imagined. God pledged that David's dynasty would endure forever, that his descendants would rule over Israel in perpetuity, and that one of his sons would indeed build the temple David had envisioned. Moreover, God promised to establish David's throne forever, making his dynasty the permanent royal house of Israel. This covenant with David became one of the foundational promises of Israelite religion and would influence Jewish and Christian expectations about the Messiah for thousands of years. David's response to this divine covenant revealed the depth of his faith and humility. Rather than being bitter about his exclusion from the temple project, he was overwhelmed by the magnitude of God's promises to his family and his nation. He composed a prayer of thanksgiving that emphasized his unworthiness to receive such blessings and his amazement at God's grace. This prayer, recorded in the biblical text, shows David at his best grateful, humble, and completely dependent on divine favor rather than his own achievements. The Davidic covenant also had immediate practical implications for the kingdom. It established the principle of dynastic succession, ensuring that the throne would pass to David's descendants rather than being subject to the kind of political chaos that had marked the transition from Saul's reign. This stability was crucial for the continued development of Israel's institutions and for maintaining the international relationships David had established through his military victories. As David's reign entered its mature phase, the kingdom he had built began to show signs of the prosperity and cultural development that would characterize Israel's golden age. Jerusalem became not only a political and religious center, but also a hub of learning and artistic achievement. The king's court attracted scholars, musicians, and craftsmen from throughout the region, creating an environment where Israelite culture could flourish and develop its distinctive characteristics. The military victories and territorial expansion had brought wealth into the kingdom through tribute, trade, and the exploitation of natural resources in conquered territories. This wealth funded not only David's building projects and military expenses, but also supported a growing merchant class and artisan community. For the first time in their history, many Israelites could contemplate prosperity and security rather than mere survival. The religious developments during David's reign were equally significant. The centralization of worship in Jerusalem, the organization of the priesthood, and the composition of psalms and other religious literature created a foundation for Israelite religion that would endure long after the kingdom itself had fallen. David's personal piety, despite his moral failures, provided a model of kingship that emphasized the ruler's responsibility to God and to the people rather than simply to his own interests. The international relationships established during David's conquests also brought Israel into contact with the broader currents of ancient Near Eastern civilization. Trade relationships, diplomatic marriages, and cultural exchange exposed the Israelites to new ideas, technologies, and artistic styles that would influence their own development. At the same time, Israel's distinctive religious and cultural identity remained strong, creating a synthesis that was both cosmopolitan and uniquely Israelite. However, the very success of David's kingdom also contained the seeds of future problems. The centralization of power in Jerusalem, while necessary for national unity, also created tensions with tribal leaders who had previously enjoyed considerable autonomy. The taxation required to fund the government and military created economic burdens that fell most heavily on the common people. The presence of foreign mercenaries and the adoption of international customs raised questions about Israel's distinctive identity and covenant relationship with God. Moreover, David's personal life, despite his public success, was marked by moral failures that would have lasting consequences for his family and kingdom. His adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband Uriah represented a profound betrayal of the moral standards he was supposed to uphold as God's anointed king. Though he repented when confronted by the prophet Nathan, the damage to his moral authority and the dysfunction it introduced into his family relationships would plague the remainder of his reign. The consequences of David's sin became apparent in the rebellion of his son Absalom, which nearly destroyed the kingdom David had worked so hard to build. Absalom's revolt was not simply a family dispute, but a serious political crisis that revealed the underlying tensions within David's kingdom. The rebellion attracted support from those who felt marginalized by David's centralized government, from tribal leaders who resented Jerusalem's dominance, and from those who questioned whether David's moral failures had disqualified him from continued rule. The civil war that followed was devastating for Israel, dividing families and tribes and threatening to undo all of David's achievements. The king was forced to flee Jerusalem. Abandoning the capital, he had made the symbol of national unity. The sight of the aged monarch, weeping as he climbed the Mount of Olives in bare feet, represented one of the lowest points in his long career. Yet even in this crisis, David's character shone through his refusal to curse those who cursed him and his continued trust in God's ultimate justice. The eventual defeat and death of Absalom ended the immediate threat to David's throne, but left lasting scars on the kingdom and the royal family. David's grief over his son's death, despite Absalom's rebellion, revealed the depth of his paternal love, but also suggested a weakness that his enemies might exploit in the future. The kingdom was reunited, but the unity was fragile and would require careful management by David's successors. As David's reign drew toward its close, the question of succession became paramount. The king had multiple sons by different wives, each with potential claims to the throne. The struggle between Adonijah and Solomon for the right of succession threatened to plunge the kingdom into another civil war, just as it was recovering from Absalom's rebellion. David's eventual choice of Solomon, influenced by his promise to Bathsheba and the counsel of the prophet Nathan, ensured continuity with the Davidic covenant, but also created resentments that would surface later in Solomon's reign. The transition from David to Solomon marked the end of an era in Israelite history. David had transformed a loose confederation of tribes into a unified kingdom, established Jerusalem as its capital, defeated its enemies, and created the foundation for future prosperity. His reign represented the fulfillment of many of the promises made to the patriarchs and the realization of Israel's potential as a chosen nation. Yet the challenges and contradictions of his rule also foreshadowed the difficulties that would eventually lead to the kingdom's division and decline. Solomon's accession to the throne around 960 BCE marked the beginning of what many consider the golden age of ancient Israel. The new king inherited a unified kingdom, secure borders, a well-organized administration, and the promise of divine blessing through the Davidic covenant. Unlike his father, who had spent much of his reign fighting wars and establishing the kingdom's foundations, Solomon would have the opportunity to focus on internal development, international diplomacy, and the great building projects that would make his reign legendary. The early years of Solomon's reign were marked by a series of actions that demonstrated both his wisdom and his ruthlessness in consolidating power. Following David's deathbed instructions, Solomon moved quickly to eliminate potential rivals and threats to his rule. Adonijah, his older brother who had attempted to claim the throne, was executed on charges of treason. Joab, David's longtime general whose loyalty had become questionable, was killed at the altar where he had sought sanctuary. Shimei, who had cursed David during Absalom's rebellion, was confined to Jerusalem and later executed when he violated the terms of his house arrest. These executions, while harsh, served to establish Solomon's authority and send a clear message that the new reign would tolerate no challenges to royal power. The young king understood that mercy, while admirable, could be interpreted as weakness by those who might threaten the stability of the kingdom. By acting decisively against potential rivals, Solomon created the secure environment necessary for the ambitious projects he was planning. Solomon's most famous characteristic, his wisdom, was established early in his reign through a divine encounter that would become one of the most celebrated stories in biblical literature. When God appeared to the young king in a dream and offered to grant any request, Solomon asked not for long life, wealth, or victory over his enemies, but for wisdom to govern his people justly. This request so pleased God that Solomon received not only the wisdom he asked for but also the riches and honor he had not sought. The demonstration of Solomon's wisdom in the famous case of the two women claiming the same baby became legendary throughout the ancient world. When both women insisted that a living child belonged to them, Solomon proposed to divide the baby with a sword, knowing that the true mother would rather give up her child than see it harmed. The real mother's immediate plea to spare the child's life revealed her identity and demonstrated Solomon's profound understanding of human nature. This judgment established his reputation for wisdom and justice that would attract visitors from distant lands seeking his counsel. The administrative system Solomon inherited from David was expanded and refined into one of the most sophisticated governmental structures in the ancient Near East. The kingdom was divided into 12 administrative districts, each responsible for providing supplies for the royal court for 1 month of the year. This system ensured a steady flow of resources to support the government and military while distributing the burden of taxation across the entire kingdom. The districts were carefully designed to cross tribal boundaries, helping to break down old loyalties and create a more unified national identity. Solomon's court became a center of learning and culture that attracted scholars, artists, and dignitaries from throughout the known world. The king himself was credited with composing thousands of proverbs and songs, and his knowledge of natural science, from plants to animals, was said to be unparalleled. This intellectual flowering was supported by the wealth flowing into the kingdom through trade and tribute, creating an environment where learning and artistic achievement could flourish. The international relationships established during David's reign were expanded and formalized under Solomon through a series of diplomatic marriages and trade agreements. The most famous of these was Solomon's marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, which cemented an alliance with Egypt and brought significant dowry gifts, including the city of Gezer. Similar marriages with princesses from other kingdoms created a network of alliances that helped ensure Israel's security and prosperity. But it was Solomon's building projects that truly defined his reign and established his lasting legacy. The construction of the temple in Jerusalem, beginning in the 4th year of his reign, was the culmination of David's dream and the fulfillment of God's promise that David's son would build a house for the divine name. The temple project was unprecedented in its scope and magnificence, requiring 7 years to complete and employing tens of thousands of workers from Israel and neighboring countries. The temple itself was a marvel of ancient architecture and craftsmanship, built of the finest cedar from Lebanon, decorated with gold throughout, and furnished with bronze work of extraordinary beauty. It was designed to be a worthy dwelling place for the God of Israel. The building followed the pattern of other ancient Near Eastern temples, but incorporated distinctively Israelite elements, particularly the absence of any image of the deity. The Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary where the Ark of the Covenant was placed, represented the presence of the invisible God among his people. The dedication of the temple was marked by celebrations that lasted for weeks and involved sacrifices on a scale never before seen in Israel. Solomon's prayer of dedication, recorded in the biblical text, revealed both his understanding of God's transcendence and his hope that the temple would serve as a place where all people could come to worship the God of Israel. The king acknowledged that no building could contain the infinite God, but expressed his faith that God would hear the prayers offered in this sacred space. The completion of the temple was followed by an even more ambitious project, the construction of Solomon's own palace complex. This massive undertaking required 13 years to complete and included not only the king's residence, but also administrative buildings, armories, and quarters for his numerous wives and concubines. The palace complex was larger than the temple itself and served as both the seat of government and a symbol of Solomon's wealth and power. The most famous feature of the palace was the Hall of the Throne, where Solomon held court and received visitors from around the world. The throne itself was made of ivory and overlaid with gold, with 6 steps leading up to it flanked by carved lions. The hall was designed to impress visitors with Solomon's wealth and wisdom, and by all accounts, it succeeded admirably. Foreign dignitaries came away amazed by what they had seen and heard, spreading Solomon's reputation throughout the ancient world. The wealth that funded these magnificent building projects came from multiple sources, but trade was perhaps the most important. Solomon's kingdom was strategically located at the crossroads between Africa, Asia, and Europe, and the king took full advantage of this position to develop extensive commercial relationships. His merchant fleet, operating from the port of Ezion, Geber on the Red Sea, traded with distant lands including Ophir, bringing back gold, silver, precious stones, and exotic goods. The most famous of Solomon's trading ventures was his partnership with Hiram, king of Tyre, in developing maritime commerce. The Phoenicians provided the ships and nautical expertise, while Israel contributed raw materials and access to overland trade routes. This partnership proved enormously profitable for both kingdoms and helped establish Israel as a major commercial power in the region. Solomon's wealth became legendary throughout the ancient world. The biblical account describes the abundance of gold in Jerusalem during his reign, claiming that silver was considered of little value because gold was so plentiful. While this may be hyperbolic, archaeological evidence and ancient records from other civilizations confirm that Solomon's kingdom was indeed extraordinarily prosperous during the 10th century BCE. The visit of the Queen of Sheba represents the pinnacle of Solomon's international reputation. This powerful ruler from southern Arabia, having heard reports of Solomon's wisdom and wealth, traveled the long distance to Jerusalem to see for herself whether the stories were true. The biblical account of her visit emphasizes her amazement at everything she saw, from the organization of Solomon's court to the magnificence of his buildings to the wisdom of his judgments. The Queen of Sheba's visit was not merely a social call, but represented serious diplomatic and commercial negotiations between two powerful kingdoms. Sheba controlled important trade routes and resources, particularly spices and precious stones, that were highly valued in Solomon's kingdom. The gifts exchanged during the visit and the ongoing relationship that developed helped expand Israel's commercial network and added to Solomon's already legendary wealth. The cultural achievements of Solomon's reign extended far beyond architecture and commerce. The king's court became a center for the collection and composition of wisdom literature, much of which was later incorporated into the biblical books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. This literary flowering reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Solomon's kingdom, which had absorbed influences from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other advanced civilizations while maintaining its distinctive Israelite character. The religious developments during Solomon's reign were equally significant. The temple became the central focus of Israelite worship, drawing pilgrims from throughout the kingdom for the major festivals. The priesthood was organized and expanded to serve the needs of this central sanctuary, and elaborate rituals were developed to mark the various religious celebrations. The Psalms attributed to this period reflect the joy and confidence of a people who felt themselves blessed by God and secure in their relationship with the divine. However, the very success and magnificence of Solomon's reign also contained the seeds of future problems. The massive building projects and lavish court lifestyle required enormous resources, leading to increasingly heavy taxation and forced labor obligations for the Israelite population. The 12 administrative districts were designed primarily to serve the needs of the central government, rather than the interests of the local populations, creating resentment among tribal leaders who had previously enjoyed considerable autonomy. The international marriages that had seemed so diplomatically advantageous also brought religious and cultural challenges. Solomon's foreign wives brought their own gods and religious practices with them, and the king, perhaps in the interests of diplomatic harmony, allowed and even participated in the worship of these foreign deities. This religious syncretism, while politically expedient, represented a fundamental violation of Israel's covenant relationship with God and undermined the religious foundations of the kingdom. The forced labor system that Solomon implemented to support his building projects created particular resentment among the northern tribes. While the king initially used only foreign captives for this purpose, the scale of his projects eventually required the conscription of Israelite workers as well. This burden fell most heavily on the northern tribes, who began to question whether the benefits of Solomon's magnificent kingdom were worth the costs they were being asked to bear. As Solomon's reign progressed, these underlying tensions began to manifest in various forms of opposition and unrest. The prophet Ahijah began to speak against the king's religious compromises, predicting that the kingdom would be divided as punishment for Solomon's unfaithfulness. Regional leaders, particularly in the northern territories, began to express dissatisfaction with the centralized government and its demands. Most significantly, a young Ephraimite named Jeroboam began to emerge as a focus for northern opposition to Solomonic rule. Jeroboam's rebellion, while ultimately unsuccessful during Solomon's lifetime, revealed the depth of discontent within the kingdom. The young man had been appointed by Solomon to oversee the forced labor from the northern tribes, giving him intimate knowledge of the grievances and frustrations of the people. When the prophet Ahijah privately anointed him as the future king of the northern tribes, Jeroboam began to organize opposition to Solomon's policies, forcing the king to attempt to kill him and driving him into exile in Egypt. The religious decline that marked the later years of Solomon's reign was perhaps the most serious threat to the kingdom's long-term stability. The king's participation in foreign religious practices, his construction of shrines for his wives' gods, and his apparent neglect of exclusive worship of the God of Israel represented a fundamental betrayal of the covenant that had established and sustained the kingdom. This religious unfaithfulness not only violated the terms of God's relationship with Israel, but also undermined the ideological foundation that justified the monarchy itself. The economic policies that had funded Solomon's magnificent achievements also began to create serious problems as the reign continued. The heavy taxation required to support the court and building projects placed an increasingly unbearable burden on the common people. While the benefits of the kingdom's prosperity seemed to flow primarily to the wealthy elite in Jerusalem, the gap between rich and poor widened significantly during Solomon's reign, creating social tensions that would contribute to the kingdom's eventual division. The military policies of Solomon's reign also differed significantly from those of his father David. While David had relied primarily on citizen soldiers motivated by religious and patriotic fervor, Solomon created a professional military establishment that included significant numbers of foreign mercenaries. This change, while perhaps militarily efficient, reduced the connection between the army and the general population and created a military force that was loyal primarily to the king rather than to the nation as a whole. The administrative efficiency that had been one of Solomon's greatest achievements also became a source of resentment as the bureaucracy grew larger and more intrusive. The 12 administrative districts, while effective in collecting taxes and organizing forced labor, disrupted traditional tribal structures and loyalties. Local leaders found their authority undermined by royal officials, and common people discovered that their lives were increasingly controlled by a distant central government that seemed more interested in extracting resources than in serving their needs. As Solomon's reign drew toward its close around 922 BCE, the contradictions and tensions that had built up over nearly 4 decades of rule were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The kingdom remained outwardly prosperous and powerful, but the foundations of unity and loyalty that David had established were seriously eroded. The religious compromises, economic burden, and political centralization that had characterized Solomon's rule had created conditions that would make the kingdom's division almost inevitable after his death. The death of Solomon marked the end of the united monarchy's golden age and the beginning of a crisis that would permanently alter the political landscape of ancient Israel. The king's son Rehoboam inherited not only the throne, but also the accumulated grievances and tensions that had been building throughout his father's reign. The new king's response to these challenges would determine whether the kingdom David had built and Solomon had glorified could survive the transition to a new generation of leadership. When representatives of the northern tribes gathered at Shechem to confirm Rehoboam's kingship over all Israel, they came with specific demands for relief from the burdens that Solomon had imposed upon them. Led by Jeroboam, who had returned from exile in Egypt upon hearing of Solomon's death, they asked the new king to lighten the heavy yoke of taxation and forced labor that his father had placed upon them. Their request was reasonable, and their willingness to accept Rehoboam as king conditional upon his response demonstrated that the kingdom's division was not yet inevitable. Rehoboam's decision to consult both his father's elderly advisors and his own young companions revealed his uncertainty about how to respond to the northern tribes' demands. The older men, who had served Solomon and understood the political realities of the kingdom, counseled moderation and compromise. They advised the new king to grant the people's request, arguing that a reputation for fairness and responsiveness would ensure their loyalty for years to come. This advice reflected both political wisdom and an understanding of the legitimate grievances that had motivated the northern tribes' petition. The younger advisors, however, counseled a very different approach. These men, who had grown up in the luxury of Solomon's court and had never experienced the hardships that the common people endured, urged Rehoboam to reject the northern tribes' demands and to assert his royal authority even more forcefully than his father had done. They suggested that any concession would be interpreted as weakness and would only encourage further demands for relief from royal obligations. Rehoboam's fateful decision to follow the advice of his young companions, rather than the wisdom of his father's counselors, revealed both his political inexperience and his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he faced. When he returned to the assembled representatives of the northern tribes, his response was harsh and uncompromising. He declared that while his father had disciplined them with whips, he would discipline them with scorpions, and that instead of lightening their burdens, he would make them even heavier. This arrogant and threatening response immediately triggered the rebellion that had been building throughout the later years of Solomon's reign. The northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, rejected Rehoboam's authority and declared their independence from the Davidic dynasty. Their rallying cry, "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel!" echoed the rebellion of Sheba during David's reign and represented a complete repudiation of the political unity that had been the foundation of the kingdom's strength. The division of the kingdom was swift and decisive. The northern tribes, which included 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, established their own kingdom with Jeroboam as their first king. They retained the name Israel for their new nation, while the southern kingdom, consisting primarily of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin along with portions of other tribes, became known as Judah. Jerusalem remained the capital of the southern kingdom, while the north initially established its capital at Shechem before later moving it to other cities. The immediate consequences of this division were catastrophic for both kingdoms. The unified state that had been strong enough to dominate the entire region was replaced by two smaller kingdoms that were often at war with each other and vulnerable to attack by external enemies. The economic benefits that had flowed from controlling the trade routes between Africa, Asia, and Europe were lost as the divided kingdoms could no longer effectively coordinate their commercial policies. The religious unity centered on the temple in Jerusalem was shattered as the northern kingdom established alternative places of worship to prevent its people from traveling to the southern capital. Jeroboam's establishment of alternative religious centers at Dan and Bethel represented one of the most significant consequences of the kingdom's division. Fearing that regular pilgrimages to Jerusalem for religious festivals would gradually undermine his people's loyalty to the northern kingdom, Jeroboam created golden calves as focal points for worship and appointed his own priests to serve at these shrines. While he may have intended these golden calves to represent platforms for the invisible God of Israel rather than rival deities, the biblical writers condemned this innovation as idolatry and traced many of the northern kingdom's subsequent problems to this fundamental religious compromise. The military consequences of the division became apparent almost immediately when Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt invaded both kingdoms, capturing numerous cities and carrying off treasures from the temple and royal palaces. This invasion, which occurred around 925 BCE, demonstrated the vulnerability of the divided kingdoms and marked the beginning of Israel's decline as a regional power. The unified kingdom under David and Solomon had been strong enough to deter such attacks, but the divided kingdoms were tempting targets for ambitious foreign rulers. The northern kingdom of Israel, despite its larger population and greater natural resources, faced particular challenges in establishing its legitimacy and stability. Unlike the southern kingdom, which could claim continuity with the Davidic dynasty and possession of the temple, the northern kingdom had to create new institutions and traditions to justify its existence. The frequent changes of dynasty and capital city that characterized its early history reflected the difficulty of establishing stable political authority in the absence of widely accepted legitimating traditions. Jeroboam's reign in the north was marked by constant military pressure from the south as Rehoboam attempted to restore the unity of the kingdom by force. The civil war between the two kingdoms consumed resources that might otherwise have been used for development and defense against external enemies. Neither kingdom was strong enough to decisively defeat the other, but both were weakened by the constant conflict and the need to maintain large military forces along their common border. The southern kingdom of Judah, while smaller and less populous than Israel, possessed certain advantages that helped ensure its survival for several centuries, longer than its northern counterpart. The presence of the temple in Jerusalem provided a powerful focus for religious loyalty that transcended political boundaries. The Davidic dynasty, despite its current troubles, retained considerable prestige based on its past achievements and the divine promises associated with it. The more defensible geography of the Judean hills also provided some protection against foreign invasions. However, Judah also faced significant challenges in the aftermath of the kingdom's division. The loss of the northern tribes meant the loss of much of the kingdom's agricultural and commercial resources. The need to defend against attacks from both Israel and external enemies stretched the kingdom's limited military resources. The religious and cultural isolation that resulted from the division limited Judah's access to the broader currents of ancient Near Eastern civilization that had enriched the kingdom during Solomon's reign. The reigns of the early kings of both kingdoms were marked by attempts to gain advantages over their rivals through foreign alliances and military campaigns. These conflicts not only weakened both kingdoms, but also provided opportunities for external powers to intervene in the region's affairs. The Aramean kingdoms to the north, the Philistines to the west, and various Arab tribes to the east all sought to exploit the division of Israel for their own benefit. The religious developments in both kingdoms during this period had lasting consequences for the development of Israelite faith and practice. The southern kingdom's exclusive control of the temple in Jerusalem led to an increased emphasis on centralized worship and priestly authority. The northern kingdom's establishment of alternative religious centers and practices created a more diverse religious landscape, but also opened the door to syncretistic influences from surrounding cultures. The prophetic movement that emerged during this period of division and conflict played a crucial role in preserving and developing Israelite religious traditions. Prophets like Elijah and Elisha in the north and various unnamed prophets in the south served as voices of religious conscience, calling both kingdoms back to faithful worship of the God of Israel and condemning the political and religious compromises that had contributed to the kingdom's weakness. The economic consequences of the division were felt by ordinary people in both kingdoms as the prosperity of Solomon's reign gave way to the hardships of constant warfare and political instability. The trade networks that had brought wealth to the United Kingdom were disrupted, and the resources that had funded magnificent building projects were diverted to military expenses. The heavy taxation that had been one of the causes of the kingdom's division continued in both kingdoms as rulers struggled to fund their governments and armies. The cultural achievements of the United Monarchy period also suffered as a result of the division. The cosmopolitan court culture that had flourished under Solomon was replaced by more provincial and militaristic societies in both kingdoms. The international reputation that had brought scholars and dignitaries to Solomon's court was lost as the divided kingdoms became absorbed in their local conflicts and struggles for survival. As the first generation after the division passed away, it became clear that the unity of David and Solomon's kingdom would not be easily restored. The institutional, religious, and cultural differences between the two kingdoms grew more pronounced over time, making reunification increasingly unlikely. The northern kingdom of Israel, with its larger population and resources, initially seemed more likely to survive and prosper. But its political instability and religious innovations created vulnerabilities that would eventually prove fatal. The southern kingdom of Judah, despite its smaller size and more limited resources, possessed certain stabilizing factors that would allow it to survive for nearly 3.5 centuries after the division. The Davidic dynasty, despite periodic challenges, maintained its hold on the throne throughout this period. The temple in Jerusalem continued to serve as a unifying religious focus, and the more conservative religious establishment in Judah proved more resistant to foreign influences than its northern counterpart. The story of the divided kingdoms that emerged from the collapse of Solomon's empire represents one of the great tragedies of ancient history. The potential that had seemed so promising during the reigns of David and Solomon was largely squandered through political miscalculation, religious compromise, and the inability of subsequent generations to maintain the unity and vision that had made the United Monarchy possible. The consequences of this division would shape the history of the people for centuries to come and would influence the development of both Judaism and Christianity in ways that continue to resonate today. The fall of the northern kingdom of Israel to the Assyrian Empire in 721 BCE marked an era that had begun with such promise under David and Solomon. The Assyrians, under their king Sargon II, completed what his predecessor Shalmaneser V had begun, systematically dismantling the political and social structure of the northern kingdom through a policy of forced deportation and resettlement that would become the hallmark of Assyrian imperial administration. The deportation of the northern tribes was not merely a punitive measure, but a calculated strategy designed to prevent future rebellions. The Assyrians understood that people separated from their ancestral lands, their religious centers, and their traditional social structures were far less likely to organize effective resistance. Tens of thousands of Israelites were forcibly relocated to distant parts of the Assyrian Empire, including regions in Mesopotamia, Media, and other conquered territories. Archaeological evidence from sites like Dur Sharrukin and Khorsabad reveals the systematic nature of these deportations, with cuneiform records documenting the precise numbers of people relocated and the locations where they were resettled. In their place, the Assyrians brought settlers from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, creating a mixed population that would later be known as the Samaritans. These new inhabitants brought their own gods and religious practices, but they also adopted some elements of Israelite religion, particularly after experiencing what they interpreted as divine punishment in the form of attacks by wild animals. This religious syncretism would create lasting tensions between the Samaritans and the Jews who remained in the south or later returned from exile. This policy of population exchange had profound consequences that extended far beyond the immediate political objectives of the Assyrian Empire. The 10 northern tribes of Israel effectively disappeared from history as distinct entities, giving rise to legends and speculation about the fate of the so-called lost tribes that continue to this day. Some scholars argue that many Israelites fled south to Judah before the final Assyrian conquest, swelling the population of Jerusalem and other Judean cities. Archaeological evidence from this period does suggest a significant increase in the population of Judah during the late 8th century BCE, supporting this theory of mass migration from the north. The survival of the southern kingdom of Judah in the face of Assyrian expansion was nothing short of miraculous. When Sennacherib, the son and successor of Sargon, launched his campaign against Judah in 701 BCE, it seemed inevitable that Jerusalem would suffer the same fate as Samaria. The Assyrian war machine had proven unstoppable throughout the Near East, crushing the great cities of Damascus, Tyre, and countless others. The Assyrian army had already conquered 46 fortified cities in Judah, according to Sennacherib's own records carved on the walls of his palace at Nineveh, and had laid siege to Jerusalem itself. King Hezekiah of Judah, who had unwisely joined an anti-Assyrian coalition led by Egypt, found himself trapped in his capital city like a bird in a cage, to use Sennacherib's own colorful description from his annals. The siege preparations were elaborate and terrifying. The Assyrians built massive earthwork ramps against the city walls, deployed their fearsome siege engines, and cut off all supply lines to the city. Inside Jerusalem, Hezekiah had prepared as best he could, constructing the famous tunnel that brought water from the Gihon spring inside the city walls, ensuring that the population would not die of thirst during a prolonged siege. Yet Jerusalem did not fall. The biblical account attributes this to divine intervention, describing how an angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night, forcing Sennacherib to withdraw to Nineveh. Modern historians have proposed various explanations for this unexpected Assyrian withdrawal, including the outbreak of plague in the Assyrian camp, possibly bubonic plague carried by rats from Egypt, the arrival of urgent news requiring Sennacherib's immediate return to deal with threats elsewhere in his empire, or possibly the payment of an enormous tribute that satisfied Assyrian demands without requiring the destruction of the city. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, recorded an Egyptian tradition that mice gnawed through the bowstrings and shield straps of the Assyrian army, rendering them defenseless. This account, while clearly legendary, may preserve a folk memory of disease striking the Assyrian forces. Whatever the precise cause, Sennacherib's own records confirm that he withdrew from Judah without capturing Jerusalem, though he claimed to have received tribute from Hezekiah and to have reduced Judean territory. Whatever the precise cause, the survival of Jerusalem in 701 BCE had enormous consequences for the development of Jewish religion and identity. The event was interpreted as proof of God's special protection for the city of David and the Temple of Solomon, reinforcing beliefs about Jerusalem's unique status that would influence Jewish thought for centuries to come. The prophet Isaiah, who had been active during this crisis, proclaimed that Jerusalem was inviolable, protected by divine promise, and this belief became deeply embedded in Jewish consciousness. This theological interpretation of Jerusalem's survival would later create problems when the city was actually destroyed by the Babylonians, forcing Jewish thinkers to grapple with the apparent contradiction between divine promise and historical reality. However, in the immediate aftermath of Sennacherib's withdrawal, the survival of Jerusalem was seen as vindication of Hezekiah's religious reforms and of the prophetic message that faithfulness to God would bring divine protection. The century following the Assyrian crisis saw significant religious and political developments in Judah. King Hezekiah had already begun important religious reforms, including the destruction of local shrines and the centralization of worship in Jerusalem. These reforms were motivated partly by political considerations, as local shrines could serve as centers of resistance to royal authority, and partly by religious convictions about the proper worship of God. Hezekiah also destroyed the bronze serpent that Moses had made in the wilderness, which had become an object of worship rather than merely a historical artifact. These reforms were continued and expanded by his great-grandson Josiah, who ruled from 640 to 609 BCE. Josiah's reforms, inspired by the discovery of what scholars believe was an early version of the Book of Deuteronomy during temple renovations in 622 BCE, represented the most comprehensive attempt to purify Jewish religious practice since the time of Solomon. The book discovered in the temple, often called the Book of the Law, provided detailed instructions for proper worship and social organization that became the foundation for Josiah's reform program. Josiah's reforms extended beyond mere religious matters to encompass significant political and social changes. He expanded Judean territory northward into the former Kingdom of Israel, taking advantage of Assyrian weakness to reclaim lands that had been lost since the division of the kingdom. This expansion was not merely territorial aggrandizement, but was justified as the restoration of the united kingdom that God had promised to David. Josiah destroyed pagan shrines and altars throughout this expanded territory, attempting to restore something approaching the religious unity that had existed under David and Solomon. The social dimensions of Josiah's reforms were equally important. The Book of Deuteronomy contained detailed provisions for social justice, including regulations about slavery, debt relief, and care for the poor. Josiah instituted these reforms as part of his broader program of religious renewal, recognizing that true worship of God required not only proper ritual observance, but also ethical behavior in social and economic relationships. The centralization of worship in Jerusalem also had economic implications, as it concentrated religious offerings and pilgrim traffic in the capital city. The optimism generated by Josiah's reforms was shattered by his death in battle at Megiddo in 609 BCE. Josiah had attempted to intercept the Egyptian pharaoh Necho, who was marching north to assist the failing Assyrian Empire against the rising power of Babylon. The geopolitical situation was complex, with the balance of power in the Near East shifting dramatically as Assyria collapsed and Babylon emerged as the dominant force. Josiah may have been motivated by a desire to prevent Egyptian forces from reaching Assyria, thereby hastening Assyrian collapse and allowing Judah greater independence. The decision to confront the Egyptians proved fatal for both Josiah personally and for the independence of Judah. Josiah was killed in the battle, possibly by an Egyptian arrow, and his army was defeated. With their reforming king dead and their army defeated, the Judeans found themselves caught between the competing imperial ambitions of Egypt and Babylon. The death of Josiah was seen by many as evidence that the reforms had failed to secure divine protection, creating a crisis of faith that would influence Jewish thought for generations. The final decades of the Kingdom of Judah were marked by political instability, foreign domination, and growing internal divisions. Josiah's son Jehoahaz ruled for only 3 months before being deposed by Pharaoh Necho, who installed Josiah's other son Joachim as a puppet ruler. This intervention demonstrated that Judah had lost its independence and was now subject to the whims of competing imperial powers. Joachim was forced to pay heavy tribute to Egypt, which required increased taxation and contributed to growing social unrest. When the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, the balance of power shifted again, and Judah was forced to transfer its allegiance to this new imperial master. The Battle of Carchemish was one of the decisive battles of ancient history, establishing Babylonian dominance over the entire Fertile Crescent and ending Egyptian ambitions in the region. For small states like Judah, these shifts in imperial power were catastrophic, as they were forced to choose sides without having any real influence over the outcome. The transition from Egyptian to Babylonian domination was not smooth, and Jehoiakim's attempts to play the two powers against each other ultimately proved disastrous. When he withheld tribute from Babylon in 601 BCE, possibly encouraged by Egyptian promises of support, Nebuchadnezzar responded with military force. The Babylonian army besieged Jerusalem, and Jehoiakim died during the siege, possibly assassinated by his own nobles who hoped to appease the Babylonians by removing the king who had defied them. Jehoiakim's 18-year-old son Jehoiachin inherited an impossible situation. Faced with a Babylonian army at the gates of Jerusalem and no prospect of effective resistance, he surrendered the city after a reign of only 3 months. The young king was taken into exile along with 10,000 of Judah's leading citizens, including the prophet Ezekiel, members of the royal family, skilled craftsmen, and military officers. This policy of selective deportation was designed to remove those most capable of organizing future resistance, while leaving the general population in place to maintain economic productivity. The Babylonian policy toward conquered peoples differed significantly from that of the Assyrians. Rather than deporting entire populations and replacing them with foreign settlers, the Babylonians typically removed only the political, religious, and intellectual elite, leaving the common people in place under new leadership. This policy was more economically efficient, as it avoided the massive disruption and expense of total population exchange, but it also created ongoing problems as the remaining population often remained loyal to their exiled leaders. Nebuchadnezzar installed Zedekiah, Josiah's youngest son, as king of the remaining population in Judah. Zedekiah's reign, from 597 to 586 BCE, was marked by constant tension between those who advocated submission to Babylon and those who urged resistance in alliance with Egypt. The deportation of the leading citizens had created a power vacuum that was filled by competing factions with different views about how to respond to Babylonian domination. The prophet Jeremiah consistently advocated acceptance of Babylonian rule as God's will, arguing that resistance would only bring greater suffering upon the people. Jeremiah's message was deeply unpopular because it seemed to counsel surrender and collaboration with foreign oppressors. However, Jeremiah argued that Babylonian rule was divine punishment for the people's sins, and that acceptance of this punishment was the path to eventual restoration. His letters to the exiles in Babylon advised them to build houses, plant gardens, and seek the welfare of the cities where they lived, because their exile would last for 70 years. However, Jeremiah's message was unpopular with both the royal court and the general population, who interpreted submission as a betrayal of their covenant with God and their national identity. The pro-Egyptian party at court argued that Babylon was overextended and vulnerable, and that a coordinated rebellion supported by Egypt could succeed in throwing off Babylonian rule. They pointed to successful rebellions in other parts of the Babylonian Empire as evidence that Nebuchadnezzar's power was not invincible. The final rebellion came in 589 BCE, when Zedekiah joined an anti-Babylonian coalition that included Egypt, Tyre, and other regional powers. The decision to rebel was encouraged by the accession of a new pharaoh in Egypt who promised military support, and by Babylonian involvement in conflicts elsewhere in the empire that seemed to provide an opportunity for successful rebellion. However, Zedekiah and his advisors seriously underestimated Babylonian military capabilities and overestimated the reliability of Egyptian support. The Babylonian response was swift and devastating. Nebuchadnezzar's army, experienced from campaigns throughout the Near East and equipped with the most advanced siege technology of the time, laid siege to Jerusalem and systematically conquered the other fortified cities of Judah. The siege of Jerusalem lasted for 2.5 years, from 589 to 586 BCE, creating conditions of extreme famine and suffering within the city. The biblical accounts describe people eating their own children and the dead lying unburied in the streets as the siege dragged on. Archaeological excavations in Jerusalem have uncovered evidence of this period, including arrowheads, siege works, and layers of destruction that confirm the biblical accounts of the siege's severity. The Babylonians built massive earthwork ramps against the city walls and deployed their siege engines to batter down the fortifications that had protected Jerusalem for centuries. When the walls of Jerusalem were finally breached in 586 BCE, the destruction that followed was systematic and complete. The Babylonian army, frustrated by the long siege and determined to make an example that would discourage future rebellions, showed no mercy to the city or its inhabitants. The Temple of Solomon, which had stood for nearly 400 years as the center of Jewish religious life, was burned to the ground after its treasures were systematically looted and carried away to Babylon. The palace complex, which had housed the Davidic dynasty for 4 centuries, was destroyed along with the homes of the wealthy and powerful. The city walls, which had protected Jerusalem since the time of David, were torn down stone by stone to ensure that the city could never again serve as a center of rebellion. The bronze pillars, Jachin and bows, the bronze sea, and other valuable items from the temple were broken up and carried away to Babylon, where they were melted down and incorporated into Babylonian temples and palaces. Most significantly, the Ark of the Covenant disappeared during this destruction and was never seen again, becoming one of history's great mysteries. The Ark, which had been the most sacred object in Jewish religion and the symbol of God's presence among the people, simply vanished from history. Some traditions suggest that it was hidden by priests before the city fell, while others propose that it was carried away to Babylon and later destroyed. The loss of the Ark was seen as evidence that God had abandoned the temple and the people, creating a theological crisis that would influence Jewish thought for centuries. Zedekiah was captured while attempting to flee the city through a secret passage that led toward the Jordan Valley. The Babylonian soldiers pursued him across the desert and captured him near Jericho, bringing him before Nebuchadnezzar for judgment. Zedekiah was forced to witness the execution of his sons before his own eyes were put out, fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy that he would see the king of Babylon but would die in darkness. The blinding of Zedekiah was both a cruel punishment and a symbolic act demonstrating the futility of resistance to Babylonian power. The surviving population was divided into 3 groups according to Babylonian policy and practical considerations. A small number of the poorest people were left in Judah under the governorship of Gedaliah, a member of a prominent Jewish family who had advocated submission to Babylon. These people were intended to maintain agricultural production in the devastated territory and to serve as a buffer against raids from neighboring peoples. However, Gedaliah was assassinated by Jewish nationalists who saw him as a collaborator, leading to further instability in the region. A larger group, including most of the surviving members of the educated and skilled classes, was taken into exile in Babylon. These exiles were settled in various locations throughout the Babylonian Empire, particularly in the region around Babylon itself, where they could be closely monitored, but also where their skills could be utilized for imperial projects. The exiles were allowed to maintain their religious and cultural practices to some extent, but they were forbidden to return to Judah and were required to contribute to the Babylonian economy through taxation and labor service. Some Jews fled to Egypt, taking the prophet Jeremiah with them against his will. These refugees established Jewish communities in various Egyptian cities, including a significant community at Elephantine in Upper Egypt that maintained its own temple and religious practices for several centuries. The flight to Egypt represented a rejection of Jeremiah's message that the future lay with the exiles in Babylon. and it created another stream of Jewish diaspora that would persist for many generations. The Babylonian exile, which lasted from 586 to 538 BCE, was a defining experience in Jewish history that transformed both Jewish religion and Jewish identity in fundamental ways. The exiles found themselves in a strange land where their traditional forms of worship were impossible to maintain. Without the temple, without the sacrificial system, without the priesthood functioning in its traditional role, and without the land that God had promised to Abraham, they were forced to develop new ways of understanding their relationship with the divine. The physical environment of Babylon was dramatically different from the hill country of Judah. The exiles found themselves in a flat, irrigated landscape dominated by massive cities, elaborate temples, and sophisticated administrative systems. The Babylonian Empire was at the height of its power and cultural achievement during this period, with Nebuchadnezzar undertaking massive building projects, including the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon and the elaborate Ishtar Gate. For Jews accustomed to the relatively simple agricultural society of Judah, the complexity and grandeur of Babylonian civilization must have been overwhelming. The exile period saw the development of several institutions and practices that would become central to Judaism. Synagogues, or houses of assembly, emerged as places where Jews could gather for prayer and study even without a temple. These institutions provided a way for Jewish communities to maintain their religious identity and social cohesion in the absence of the central institutions that had previously defined Jewish life. The synagogue would later become the fundamental institution of Jewish religious life throughout the diaspora. The role of the scribe became increasingly important as the preservation and interpretation of sacred texts took on new urgency. With the temple destroyed and the priestly system disrupted, the written word became the primary means of maintaining connection with Jewish tradition and law. Scribes not only copied and preserved existing texts, but also began the process of editing and organizing the various traditions that would eventually become the Hebrew Bible. The Sabbath became more significant as a marker of Jewish identity that could be observed anywhere, not just in the Promised Land. The practice of circumcision also took on new importance as a sign of Jewish identity that could not be taken away by exile or persecution. These portable aspects of Jewish religion allowed Jews to maintain their distinctiveness even when separated from their ancestral land and central religious institutions. The intellectual and spiritual ferment of the exile period produced some of the most profound works in Jewish literature. The prophet Ezekiel, writing from Babylon, developed a vision of restoration that included detailed plans for a new temple and a reconstituted priesthood. Ezekiel's prophecies combined harsh criticism of the people's past sins with elaborate promises of future restoration, providing both explanation for the current suffering and hope for eventual redemption. The anonymous prophet known as Second Isaiah, whose works are found in chapters 40 through 55 of the book of Isaiah, articulated a theology of universal monotheism that would profoundly influence later Jewish and Christian thought. Second Isaiah proclaimed that the God of Israel was not merely the national deity of the Jewish people, but the creator and ruler of the entire universe, who used even pagan empires like Babylon and Persia to accomplish divine purposes. The Deuteronomistic history, which includes the books of Joshua through 2 Kings, was compiled and edited during this period as an attempt to understand the theological meaning of the exile. This historical work interpreted the entire sweep of Israelite history from the conquest of Canaan to the destruction of Jerusalem as a demonstration of the consequences of obedience and disobedience to God's law. The exile was presented not as evidence of God's weakness or abandonment of the people, but as divine punishment for the people's persistent violation of their covenant obligations. Perhaps most importantly, the exile forced Jews to grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of God and the meaning of their covenant relationship. If God was truly sovereign over all nations, why had the chosen people been defeated and exiled by pagans who worshipped false gods? If the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were eternal, how could the land be lost and the temple destroyed? If the Davidic covenant was supposed to last forever, how could the monarchy come to an end? The answers developed during this period emphasized God's justice in punishing the people for their sins, particularly their worship of foreign gods and their failure to observe the social justice requirements of the law. However, these theological explanations also maintained hope for future restoration based on God's faithfulness to the covenant promises. The exile was interpreted as temporary punishment rather than permanent abandonment, and prophetic literature from this period is filled with promises of eventual return and restoration. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE under Cyrus the Great opened new possibilities for the Jewish exiles. Cyrus followed a policy of religious tolerance and cultural restoration that was dramatically different from the practices of previous empires. Rather than seeking to impose Persian religion and culture on conquered peoples, Cyrus allowed and even encouraged subject peoples to maintain their own traditions and institutions. His famous cylinder, discovered by archaeologists in the 19th century, proclaims his intention to restore displaced peoples to their homelands and to rebuild their temples. This policy was motivated partly by religious conviction, as Cyrus worshipped Ahura Mazda, a deity who was understood to be tolerant of other religious traditions, and partly by practical political considerations, as Cyrus recognized that contented subjects were more likely to remain loyal to Persian rule. The biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah describe how this policy was applied to the Jewish exiles, allowing them to return to Judah and rebuild their temple. However, these biblical accounts, written from the perspective of the returning exiles, may oversimplify what was actually a complex and gradual process that extended over several generations. The Persian Empire was vast and complex, and implementing new policies throughout its territories required time and careful administration. The return from exile, however, was far more complicated than the biblical accounts might suggest. Not all Jews chose to return to Judah. Many had established successful lives in Babylon and saw no reason to abandon their prosperity for the uncertainties of rebuilding in a devastated land. The Jewish community in Babylon had developed its own institutions and leadership during the exile period, and many Jews felt more secure remaining in this established community than venturing into the unknown challenges of restoration. Those who did return found a situation far different from what they had expected. The land was not empty waiting for their arrival, but was occupied by people who had developed their own religious and social practices during the nearly 50 years of exile. These people, who included both Jews who had never been exiled and various non-Jewish groups who had settled in the region, had created their own synthesis of religious traditions that the returning exiles viewed as corrupted and illegitimate. The returning exiles, led initially by Sheshbazzar and later by Zerubbabel, faced enormous challenges in re-establishing Jewish life in Judah. The physical infrastructure of the country had been largely destroyed during the Babylonian conquest and had not been maintained during the subsequent decades. Roads were impassable, irrigation systems had collapsed, and most of the major cities lay in ruins. The work of physical reconstruction required enormous resources and labor that the small community of returnees could barely provide. The religious infrastructure was even more problematic, as there was no functioning temple, no established priesthood, and considerable disagreement about proper religious practices. The returning exiles brought with them religious traditions that had developed during the exile period, while those who had remained in the land had maintained their own religious practices adapted to local conditions. Reconciling these different approaches to Jewish religious life required delicate negotiation and compromise. The social infrastructure was perhaps most challenging of all, as the returning exiles had to integrate with the people who had remained in the land while maintaining their sense of religious and cultural distinctiveness. The returnees generally considered themselves to be the true representatives of Jewish tradition, while the people of the land saw the returnees as foreigners who had lost touch with local conditions and needs. These tensions created conflicts that would persist for generations and would influence the development of Jewish identity in the post-exilic period. The rebuilding of the temple, which began around 520 BCE under the leadership of Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua, became a focal point for these various tensions. The project was supported by Persian authorities as part of their policy of religious restoration, and Persian officials provided both financial resources and administrative support for the reconstruction effort. However, the actual work of rebuilding required the cooperation of various groups within the Jewish community, and this cooperation was often difficult to achieve. The older generation, who remembered Solomon's temple in its glory, wept when they saw the foundation of the new temple, because it seemed so modest in comparison to what had been lost. The second temple was built on a much smaller scale than Solomon's temple, partly because of limited resources and partly because the returning community was much smaller than the population that had supported the original temple. The contrast between past glory and present reality was a constant reminder of how much had been lost during the exile period. Samaritan offers to help with the construction were rejected by the returning exiles, creating lasting hostility between the two communities. The Samaritans, who were descendants of the mixed population that had been settled in the former northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians, claimed to worship the same God as the Jews and offered to participate in the temple reconstruction. However, the returning exiles viewed Samaritan religion as contaminated by foreign influences and refused to accept their assistance. This rejection had profound consequences for the relationship between Jews and Samaritans, creating a schism that would persist for centuries. The Samaritans eventually built their own temple on Mount Gerizim and developed their own version of Jewish religious tradition, which they claimed was more authentic than the religion practiced in Jerusalem. The conflict between Jews and Samaritans would continue throughout the Second Temple period and would influence the development of both communities. Opposition from local governors and other regional powers repeatedly interrupted the work of temple reconstruction. The Persian Empire was divided into satrapies, or provinces, each governed by a Persian official who was responsible for maintaining order and collecting taxes. Some of these officials viewed the Jewish temple project with suspicion, seeing it as a potential center of rebellion against Persian authority. Letters preserved in the Book of Ezra document some of these conflicts and the appeals made by both sides to the Persian court for resolution. The work was not completed until 515 BCE, nearly 20 years after it had begun. The delays were caused by a combination of political opposition, resource shortages, and internal conflicts within the Jewish community. The completion of the temple was celebrated with great rejoicing, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in Jewish history that was quite different from the pre-exilic period. The Second Temple, as it came to be known, never achieved the splendor or the central role in international affairs that Solomon's temple had enjoyed. The original temple had been built during the height of Israelite power and prosperity, when the United Kingdom controlled important trade routes and commanded respect from neighboring powers. The Second Temple, by contrast, was built by a small community that was subject to Persian authority and had limited resources and political influence. Nevertheless, the Second Temple served as a crucial symbol of Jewish restoration and continuity. The dedication ceremony, described in the Book of Ezra, was marked by great celebration and sacrifice, but also by the recognition that this was a new era in Jewish history. Different from the glorious past, but still connected to it through the covenant promises of God. The temple provided a focal point for Jewish religious life and a symbol of divine presence that helped to unite the scattered Jewish communities. The religious and social reforms instituted by Ezra and Nehemiah in the 5th century BCE were designed to address the challenges of maintaining Jewish identity in this new situation. These reforms were based on a strict interpretation of Torah law and were intended to prevent the assimilation that had contributed to the downfall of the original kingdoms. The reformers recognized that Jewish survival in the post-exilic period would require clear boundaries between Jews and non-Jews and strict adherence to distinctive Jewish practices. Ezra, described as a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, led a second wave of return around 458 BCE and instituted comprehensive religious reforms based on strict adherence to Torah law. Ezra brought with him a copy of the Torah that may have been the first complete version of the 5 books of Moses, and he instituted regular public readings of this text to educate the people about their religious obligations. These public readings became an important feature of Jewish religious life and helped to establish the Torah as the central authority in Jewish religious and social life. His most controversial action was requiring Jewish men who had married foreign women to divorce them and send away their children, a policy designed to prevent the assimilation that had contributed to the downfall of the original kingdoms. This policy was extremely harsh and caused great suffering among the affected families, but Ezra and his supporters argued that it was necessary to preserve Jewish religious and cultural identity. The policy reflected a new understanding of Jewish identity that emphasized religious and ethnic purity rather than simply residence in the land of Israel. Nehemiah, who served as Persian-appointed governor of Judah around 445 BCE, focused on physical and social reconstruction. He organized the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls despite opposition from neighboring peoples, recognizing that the city needed physical security before it could serve as an effective center for Jewish life. The wall building project was completed in just 52 days, according to Nehemiah's own account, though this rapid completion was achieved only through extraordinary organization and the participation of the entire community. Nehemiah also instituted economic reforms designed to address the poverty and debt that plagued the returned community. Many Jews had been forced to mortgage their fields and houses to pay Persian taxes, and some had even sold their children into slavery to meet their obligations. Nehemiah forced the wealthy members of the community to cancel these debts and to return mortgaged property to its original owners, recognizing that economic inequality threatened the survival of the Jewish community. His memoirs, preserved in the biblical book that bears his name, provide a vivid picture of the challenges faced by the early post-exilic community. Nehemiah describes constant threats from neighboring peoples, internal conflicts within the Jewish community, and the enormous practical difficulties of rebuilding a society that had been destroyed. His account also reveals the personality of a man who was deeply committed to Jewish restoration, but who was also practical and politically astute. The Persian period, lasting from 538 to 332 BCE, was crucial for the development of Judaism as we know it today. During this time, the Torah was edited into its final form, establishing the foundation of Jewish law and practice for all subsequent generations. This editorial process involved combining various sources and traditions that had been preserved during the exile period and organizing them into a coherent legal and narrative framework. The institution of the synagogue became more widespread during this period, creating a network of local religious communities that could function independently of the temple. Synagogues served not only as places of worship, but also as centers of education and community governance, providing a structure that could maintain Jewish identity even in small and scattered communities. The development of the synagogue was crucial for the survival of Judaism during the later diaspora period. The role of the scribe and the teacher became increasingly important during the Persian period, leading to the development of a class of religious scholars who would later be known as rabbis. These scholars were responsible for interpreting and applying Torah law to the changing conditions of Jewish life, and they developed methods of legal interpretation that would become central to rabbinic Judaism. The emphasis on study and interpretation meant that Judaism could adapt to new circumstances while maintaining its essential character. The relative autonomy enjoyed by the Jewish community under Persian rule allowed for significant internal development and consolidation. The high priest in Jerusalem became not only the religious leader, but also the political head of the community, a situation that would continue under subsequent empires. This combination of religious and political authority in the priesthood had important consequences for the development of Jewish institutions and for the relationship between religious and secular authority in Jewish society. The province of Judah was small and economically marginal within the vast Persian Empire, but it was allowed to govern its internal affairs according to Jewish law, creating a precedent for religious self-government that would be important in later periods. This autonomy was limited and was always subject to Persian oversight, but it provided the Jewish community with the space needed to rebuild its institutions and to develop its distinctive religious and cultural practices.